and welcome to the education section of Discovering Salem 1692. If you're familiar with my project from last semester, you will see that this guide is really an expansion of what I've already built. Before I walk you through all the pages, I'm just going to kind of give you a visual representation of the main activity that I've put together for teachers to use with students. So this activity is going to be focusing on the historiography of the Salem witch trials. And this timeline sheet is going to be the backbone of whichever activity option students and teachers are going to be undertaking here. So with that in mind, I'm just going to go back real quick to the teacher's guide and show you what I've put together for educators. Educators will have a welcome video, which will kind of go over a little bit more in depth everything I just told you. I thought it was a really important resource to hear from the creator of the project, that they understand exactly what my intent was behind each of the individual pages and the resources I provided with them. I've also provided a really in-depth unit overview. Students will be ideally exploring each decade themselves, and I wanted to provide educators with kind of a summary of what their students are going to be looking at and what connections ideally their students are making by looking at the sources. And then of course I have provided an activity guide. So based on that timeline that I showed you at the beginning of the video, I have provided educators with two different options, one being an individual activity followed by a group discussion, and the second a group project followed by a presentation. With the individual activity, students will be filling out the timeline worksheets themselves and will be following up with a really great in-class discussion. If educators go with option 2, students will be divided into groups of 5, one for each decade, and they will research each individual decade themselves and then present the decade to the class. A group presentation like this is meant for if, say, the group from 1990, since I'm circling that here, is presenting, everybody who is not in that group is taking notes based on the presentation the students are giving them. Something that's really important to note too on this timeline, I think, is that I designed this quite huge so that way teachers can print out a really large copy for their students to fill in. I've also provided a number of additional resources for educators to provide, including a grading rubric as well as follow-up essay prompts that they might give their students. Now, when the students go in to complete the activity based on what their teachers tell them to do, there's an introduction video that walks them through the site and shows them exactly how to use the timeline best to their advantage. And then they'll be able to go through each page and click through the resources I've provided. Something that you'll note here is that the sources are sectioned off, and those sections match and emulate the sections underneath each decade. The sources I provided include Wikipedia entries for setting the scene for the decade, peer reviews of the key historiographical source published by historians during that decade, and then also primary sources that were actually used by the author of those key sources that they're going to be looking at. At the end of going through the activity, students will also make predictions as to where they think the historiography of the Salem witch trials will go into the next decade. That's kind of the high-level overview of my project. I'm looking forward to you exploring my site and getting some great feedback from my peers.